Great reporting, Anthony, especially about that subway attack. My gosh, that's if anybody, you can watch that video again. It's pretty horrific. But I want to talk more about the Kamiyah Mobley case. It's something that we actually covered here on Law and Crime, the sentencing hearing of Gloria Williams, and it's always an interesting case to follow. Let's bring back on Gary Gerstenfield. Gary, the mother, the biological mother of Kamiyah Mobley says, I wish they never would have found her. And after all of these years of not having her daughter, and she finally gets her back, this is what she says. What do you think about this?
You know, it's one of these things that you are puzzled by, but I think a lot of it has to do with just personal pain. And sometimes, you know, things don't, reality sometimes and what you think things are going to be are just painfully different. And all I can take it from her is just a lack of recognition on her part, or a lack of reality on her part.
You can't deny that it's tragic. It's tragic.
Oh,
but for the mother to say, I don't deal with disrespect, I wish they never would have found her, because this young, innocent girl who had no choice in what her life was going to be has a relationship with Gloria Williams, who raised her for years. That's not fair.
Well, I guess, you know, something that I've been saying to my kids, you know, their entire lives, you know, life is seldom fair. And, you know, this is one of those examples, I guess.
So how do, you know, you think about it, the justice system, we're looking for justice, right? You would think in a common case scenario where there's a kidnapped baby brought back to the parents, that's the justice. But in this kind of situation, are people probably looking at this and saying, what is best for Kamiyah or Alexis, however she wants to go? I mean, her biological mother seems to not want to have a relationship with her, and the mother that raised her is now in jail. What does she do?
You know, it's a bizarre situation, because it's like I had a great mom, except for the fact that she abducted me, and the fact that, you know, now I'm going to be back with this woman who I don't know, I don't have a relationship with, and the world that I thought that I knew and the world I thought I understood now has been really turned topsy-turvy. And you're right, the legal system sometimes, you know, plodding along and doing what it's supposed to do, sometimes seems to come up with a result that seems somewhat, if not unfair, certainly curious. But the bottom line is, you can't abduct a child, even with the best of intent. Even if you're a great parent and you do a great job, it doesn't excuse the original sin. You know, not to get religious here on us, but, you know, you can't abduct a child, even with the best of intent, and even if you're going to be the best mom. And maybe this is what, if anything else, maybe that's what this case stands for.
You know, and let's take a step back. Shanara Mobley, okay, didn't have her daughter for years. She was taken from her. In the sentencing hearing for Gloria Williams, she said, I think Williams should be sentenced to death. And so doesn't she have a point that, how could my biological daughter have a relationship with her kidnapper? Do you think there's a justifiable, do you think she has a point there?
Well, I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, there is a theory that applies where sometimes where people have been abducted and then they turn on to or have an affection for their abductor. There becomes sort of this unique dynamic. I don't think that's the situation here. I think it's an honest affection based upon years of being raised and seemingly being a good person. I mean, you know, of course, the proof's always in the pudding. For all we can tell, this young lady has grown up to be a responsible and a productive person. And so, again, it is a curious case. And, you know, thankfully, families don't get to choose the sentences. You know, we don't have Sharia law in this country. And so, you know, the sentencing will be carried out appropriately for the transgression, as serious as it is. But one of the factors I think that will be considered is ultimately, how did the child raise? How did the child fare?
Well, Gary, you know, Gloria Williams was sentenced to 18 years for the kidnapping. Yeah. Do you think that is fair? Do you think, not fair, do you think that is an appropriate punishment?
Well, of course, you know, these things have guidelines, and so there's a range of what a sentence can be. But typically, abducting a child, taking the child away from a parent, you know, that is about as serious a crime as a parent, you know, that I could ever imagine or fashion. The fact that the child is otherwise okay is a relief, but it doesn't take away from the crime of abduction of a child. You know, when we talk about abducting of a child, I mean, just think what effect that has, the Amber Alerts. I mean, just that has a visceral impact.
Of course.
In our
It's
community.
horrific to think about from all these angles, and it's a really difficult case. We'll talk more about that case. You can go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more about it. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back. That was critical testimony for the prosecution right there. A neighbor of the defendant saying that he heard him say, "I'm going to beat him and I'm going to kill him," meaning 10-year-old Kente. In a murder case, that can be really good ammunition. Let's bring back in Gary Gerstenfield. Gary, you tell me, is that evidence that he intended to kill his adopted son, or is that somebody who was just saying, blowing off steam, and he didn't really mean it, or in a way say that he was just joking, which is something we've heard from the defense's side?
Well, I think joking is probably the wrong emotion, but I think hyperbole could be an argument saying, look, this was a moment in time where I was very angry. You know, I could just kill him. I'm so upset. I could bash their brains in. You know, people say all kinds of stuff, as you say, blowing off steam. The problem here is when you say, I'm going to kill this person, or I could just kill this person, and then you kill the person, you know, it's 1 and 1 generally does equal 2. So it certainly is. It certainly adds on. The history of violence that this child, Kente, suffered, the tragedy of how he died, all of this collectively will not bode well for Leon Williams, regardless of this specific statement. That being said, it certainly adds on to all the evidence that's going to be presented by the state.
I'll tell you what else won't bode well for the defendant, the testimony of Yolanda Ingram, another neighbor. And I want you to listen very carefully to what she had to say, because it's not good for Mr. Williams. Take a look.
And then what happened after you and Alicia split with Kente?
I seen a bag in Kente hand, and it was a bill. So I seen that holding his own brother, and I think that's the word it was. And he was like, you know, and as they was getting ready to walk away, Leon said, you know, tell Kente to come on. He was like, oh, you're going to die tonight. And I said, yeah, don't say that. So we got a little further, I don't know if you can see it, it's a tree. And he said, we got a tree, he said it again. And I stood, you know, I said, now Leon, don't say that. You know, like, who would say you didn't kill somebody? And literally, I didn't think you could do it, but just, you know.
Another neighbor saying that Williams was said to Kente, I want to make sure I say this, oh, you're going to die tonight. Gary, again, another neighbor coming forward. But here's my question.
Sure.
We heard the defense's strategy for the first time yesterday, and they're saying that the Williams, their client, is responsible for the death of Kente, but it's not murder. What does that mean?
You know, as a criminal defense attorney, I spend a lot of time, you know, trying to fashion a defense sometimes when you get really bad facts and you're trying to come up with some argument like this was an accident. You know, I didn't mean to. This is the form of punishment that I grew up with. This is what I understand. You know, it got out of hand. That's the only real defense you can possibly come up with, and the likelihood of that working is it's not going to work.
Well, let me see if I understand this. Are you saying that he could make? Hey, listen, he grew up in a different generation. The defendant, he was
Right.
he was beat. That's how you discipline kids. And from all accounts, young Kente maybe had issues with behavior and autism, I think, is a report.
Right.
But the idea that to beat a child, is the defense asking the jury to take a step back and get into the defendant's shoes?
Well, to some degree, you have to do that as a fact finder when you're trying to determine whether somebody had the specific intent to commit a crime. These are crimes that do require specific intent. If you're talking about murder, particularly the variety that the state's prosecuting Mr. Williams for. So yeah, to some degree, you have to get into the mind of the individual, the defendant. Now, obviously, we can't do that. We can't get in people's minds. We look at their actions, we look at their statements, we look at things they've said, and that brings these two important statements from these two different witnesses into play. And of course, we look at the actual conduct. And then from all of that, we collectively try to figure out what was the specific intent of the defendant. And was the intent here to punish Kente, as grotesque as it was? Was it an attempt to try to change his behavior, or was it an attempt to to murder this child? And that's ultimately the decision that the jury is going to be stuck with. But as you point out, I mean, these are just horrible facts, and it's just a horrific ending for this young
And just so I understand, and the viewers understand, real quick, we have about 20 seconds. This is the ultimate goal for them would be to convince the jury this was an accident?
Anything that takes the specific intent to commit murder out of the game would be a win for the state. I mean, for the defense.
Well, we'll have to see if that ultimately works. We're going to continue our live coverage of this case when we return a bit later on. This has been a really exciting case to watch so far, but as I said, a tragic case when you have the death of such a young child. 10 years old, a really beautiful young child.
Absolutely.
And so when we get back, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to play you the testimony of Alicia Nash, another neighbor of the defendant. I can tell you it's not so good for Mr. Williams. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Another neighbor comes forward and says that she overheard Williams say, "You're going to die tonight," to Kente. Let's bring back on Gary Gerstenfield. Gary, another neighbor saying this. Now, I can't help but think they talk so much about, in this case, how Child Protective Services may have made a mistake, which they claim they did. But do you think the neighbors owed a sense of responsibility, or they had a duty to protect Kente and report what they saw?
Well, certainly a moral duty. I'm not sure there's I know there's unfortunately not a legal duty, but there is certainly, I think, a moral duty as a neighbor, as a good neighbor. If you see something, you should report it. There is a culture in our, it's a growing problem in our community, which is that when people see something that's bad or objectionable or something that should cause them to want to make a call to authorities, there's this sort of natural reluctance that people just don't want to, quote, get involved. And unfortunately, sometimes with tragic results, as we see in the case of young Kente.
And do you think Child Protective Services, who I think they fired 3 employees as a result of failure to stop this, what happened there? How could this have not been prevented?
Well, the main obligation in terms of watching a child or taking care of a child is food, shelter, clothing. And so, if social workers, make an appointment, see the child's well fed, the child's clothed, there's shelter, those 3 things are sort of taken care of. They don't see obvious injuries. If the child isn't explaining that there's a problem, if neighbors aren't reporting anything, a 5-minute, 10-minute meeting with the father or with the child probably isn't going to disclose these sort of things that are happening. And so I think probably that's what happened in this case.
I mean, we're trying to find answers as to why this happened, because it shouldn't have happened. But I want to play the testimony right now of another witness, David Walker, who is from the Fire and Rescue Department, one of the first responders who responded when young Kente was non-responsive. Now, here's the question. This is an important part of testimony, because listen to what Leon was doing when David Walker came there, and does this perhaps give evidence of his not being guilty? Take a look. I love a good piece of testimony there, because it can go both ways. David Walker, this first responder, said Leon, the defendant, Leon Williams, was giving chest compressions to young Kente when he responded. On the other hand, when Walker asked him what happened, he was not responsive, didn't give any information. Gary, let's talk about this for a second. If the fact that Leon is giving chest compressions to the victim, doesn't that say that he didn't intend for him to die? He didn't intend to kill him?
Well, it's probably the only positive evidence I think that the defense has really to offer. When we look to what people accused of committing murder typically do after the crime, we use that for guidance to see sort of what was going through their mind. So typically what we see in murder cases is the effort of concealment and not wanting to call in authorities. In this case, Walker, the paramedic Walker, Mr. Walker showed up, and he sees he sees life sustaining or life promoting effort on the part of the father or the stepfather. Certainly that's positive. Does that negate all the bad things?
No.
I mean, this is the balancing act that ultimately the jury's going to have to decide.
Not an easy question for them to decide, but another witness that they looked at and heard the testimony from was Jennifer Dugan, a paramedic. Listen very carefully to what happened when she arrived on the scene. Take a look.
When we were trying to...
Let's talk a little bit more about that. Gary Gerstenfield, welcome back. That was an interesting part of testimony. He said, what happened, according to this witness, Leon asked, is Kente okay? And they ain't going to give me another kid now. This is not Skittles. This is not giving out candy. This is about a human being, a child. The fact that the jurors just heard this piece of testimony, what's going on in their minds?
Again, I mean, you know, you're looking at this case trying to understand, you know, is this a murder case? Is this something other than a murder case? Clearly, this guy is not connected with reality. I mean, this is to opine that, oh, I guess I'm not going to get another child now because I've, you know, killed this one.
Yeah, I'll just get another one. I'll just get another one. Sure, I'll replace him.
Go down to the kiddie store, go to the children's farm, pick up another child. I mean, clearly there's a lack of appreciation or respect for what it is to adopt a child. I mean, this guy's clearly disconnected. In terms of whether or not he's going to be convicted of murder or not, I think defense has an uphill battle because there's just nothing attractive about this guy, particularly when you listen to these three witnesses and you hear the anger and the angst. And, you know, you mentioned about earlier, and I thought it was a very good question, about whether social services has any role to play in this case. You know, when you're talking about making placement of a child with special needs, you really need to do a serious vetting of that potential parent to make sure they understand what they're getting. Because raising a child with special needs, one of my best friends has a son who is autistic. And I can tell you, he and his mother, I'm talking about my friends, they absolutely have the patience of Job when it comes to taking care of their son. I don't think any parent can appreciate how challenging it is to raise a special needs kid. And I think that where the failure here comes into play is the failure to, I think, fully vet out who this person is. Because making that comment, yeah, I'm not going to get another one, I mean, that lack of connection with reality seems so obvious that it really does, I think, raise the issue of whether the social services had their act together at all.
And especially when he's the adopted father. The adopted father. He made the choice to take care of this boy, and look what happened. I want to play some more of the testimony of Jennifer Dugan, the paramedic. Listen to what happened when young Kente arrived at the hospital. Take a look. Well, according to this witness, Leon Williams, the defendant, couldn't wait to get out of the hospital and did not want to be there. So, Gary Gerstenfield, how does that play from what we just heard? He kept saying, I gotta go, I need to get out of here. You know, that's not looking good for his defense team. Am I correct?
Well, look, it absolutely doesn't look good. And the problem here that, you know, again, you know, often with these cases, I really sort of feel for the defense attorney because you're trying to do something. And, you know, these great, horrible facts keep coming in. You're like, oh, great, I got to go. I got someplace else I want to be. What this shows, I think, to a jury more than anything else is just the disconnect that the dad has with his son. The lack of recognition, lack of taking responsibility, lack of accountability. The only good fact that he has is the fact that he did call 911 and he was trying to do something with the child. There's no information at this point whether he actually knows how to give CPR. But assuming for the moment that, you know, he does, or he was trying to do something effective, does that take away from the horror of everything else he's done? I don't think it does.
Right, and in a normal case, you could have said, or in any other case, you could have been like, I need to get out of here, I'm panicking, my son just got, you know, he could maybe turn it that way. But with all these facts coming towards him, it paints a picture that he does not want to paint. The only saving grace for him is, like, as you said, those chest compressions. We have a lot more to talk about in this case, as well as some other top crime stories. We'll be right back after this short break. Thank you, Anthony. You can go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more of those stories. But I want to talk about the Kamaya Mobley story. It's one that we covered here on Law and Crime. We covered the Gloria Williams sentencing hearing when she was sentenced to 18 years in prison for kidnapping that baby from a hospital. Let's bring back in our guest for this morning, criminal defense attorney Gary Gerstenfield. Gary, again, this woman, the Shanara Mobley, the biological mother, her saying, I wish they never would have found her. How confusing is that for young, for this Alexis Manigault or Kamaya Mobley, whatever name she would like to go by? She has her mother who doesn't want anything to do with her, and then she has the mother who raised her in jail. How impossible of a situation is this for her?
You know, poor Alexis. You know, that's a tough question to answer. But I think part of it is that, you know, Shannara feels, from what I can gather, is a feeling of sort of two layers of betrayal. The first was that she lost her child at birth. She gets the child back and then finds out the child wants to maintain a relationship with the woman that abducted her. And, you know, there's sort of a sense of, hey, I am your real mother. You know, you shouldn't even talk to this other woman. And Alexis clearly doesn't want to do that. So, you know, there's definitely a rift between the two of them. I think there's a lot of anger between the two of them. And so I don't think Alexis is that upset by it, because I think she's upset that she doesn't have the relationship she wants to have with the mother that has, as far as she knows, raised her.
But Shannara has a point. I mean, in the Williams hearing, she said that if she had her way, she would sentence Williams to death. And her baby was taken away from her entire life. Do you think when she said that I wish she never returned, maybe a part of her wishes that, in the sense, because not having a relationship with your child for so many years, to have now started back up again when she's already so ingrained with the relationship with Williams, it creates more difficulty. Perhaps she felt that, let's just move on. It was a tragic moment in my life, but I'm going to move forward. But then at the same point in the hearing, which we covered, she was saying how grateful she was to have her back. Now she made a 180.
Well, she was hoping that, you know, I mean, think about it. Your child's been abducted, and then, of course, you know, you think the worst, your child is dead, and then you suddenly get this notice that your child is alive and well and healthy, and you have this idea of this reunification. It's going to be a wonderful experience, and then, you know, life unfortunately doesn't work out the way you want it to. So there's that second layer of betrayal, or that second line of betrayal. You know, both these women, I think, all these people are hurting.
Right.
And you know, the bottom line, I guess, to this whole thing is, unfortunately, you know, as you pointed out so well earlier on, there's no happy ending in this case.
Unfortunately, there is no happy ending. And when you look at Gloria Williams,
sometimes there's not.
You know, this is a different kind of case. This isn't a standard kidnapping case where there's a torture and abuse and a dead body. She was raised,
right,
by all accounts, in a great way. Look who she grew up to be. Do you think 18 years in prison for Gloria Williams was the appropriate punishment?
You know, I've never personally been very good at the idea of what sentencing should be. In this country, we sentence to people to very long sentences that in Europe leave, you know, European courts very surprised, because, you know, in Europe they don't have these kind of long sentences. This is sort of a unique quality about American jurisprudence. Unfortunately, we do have sentencing guidelines, and the 18 years falls within the guidelines because, after all, you did have an abduction of a child. And if you stop and think about some of the changes, you know, today we have play dates. Kids don't play outside unattended. We know where it's led to what we call helicopter parenting. All of that started from the Orange Bowl incident here in Maryland, actually, back in the late 70s, when two girls literally disappeared, were and never seen again. And I think their bodies were eventually recovered very recently. But that effect, the Orange Bowl incident, this abduction of these two beautiful girls, that effect had a ripple effect throughout this entire country. And today, you know, a child abduction is one of the most terrifying issues as parents that, you know, we deal with. And of course, that's exactly what happened in this case. So in light of the abduction of a child, obviously we're not dealing with the Leon Williams case where a child was murdered, or well, I guess that's what they're trying to figure out, but certainly we have a dead child. We don't have that by all measure. Alexis seems to be a nice, healthy, well-adjusted person, but still, it doesn't take away the abduction.
And you can't help but think, what is Kamaya or Alexis? What is she supposed to do right now? Should she just treat her mother, who's in, let me rephrase, the person who raised her, Gloria Williams, as her mother, continue to visit her in prison and act, that's my main maternal source? Does she try to get a relationship back with Shannara? I mean, she was such an innocent victim. She was a baby. She didn't have a say in what was going to happen to her life. So I guess as we conclude this segment, what should she do?
Well, time will tell. I mean, clearly she wants to maintain a relationship with the woman that she thinks of as her mother, and so I suspect that she'll continue to maintain that contact. In a perfect world, it would be nice if that she can pick up the pieces with her birth mother and somehow start a relationship there as well. I think what she has to reconcile is the fact that you can still love the mother that has raised you and have a relationship with the birth mother. It won't be the same kind of relationship. You're not going to create the ties, the emotional connection that you would expect between a mother and a child with all these years. And of course, the surprise I did, but you can forge a relationship, and hopefully in the years and time to come in the future, that'll happen.
Well, hopefully. It's an incredibly difficult situation. We're going to always cover it and update our viewers about the Kamiyah Mobley case. But let's switch gears now to another challenging situation about a young child. This is the case out of Georgia. We're waiting for the live feed in the courtroom. Leon Williams is the adopted father, of 10-year-old Kente, and he is accused of killing him by drowning him to death as a form of corporal punishment gone bad. Maybe that's the way to explain it, possibly. Well, I want to play you the testimony of a lead detective in this case who tested and collected some critical items from the Williams house. So let's take a look at that testimony right now. So we're learning about what was collected from the defendant's home. Let's bring on Gary Gerstenfield. How important is it to understand what was in the home and what may have been used to, how shall I say this, be a form of punishment for the young Kente? I mean, the level of abuse that we believe he suffered is unbelievable. I mean, burning of the feet, can't make this stuff up, and I don't want to.
No, it's absolutely horrific, and the 10-year-old Kente suffered tremendously. I mean, first of all, he's autistic, which means he has a perception issue to begin with, and he's acting out, which means that he's upset. Rather than finding ways to calm him down and find ways to connect with the child, instead the child's being hurt. So imagine the torture of not being able to comprehend your environment, and add to that being tortured, which is what exactly happened to this kid. It is unfathomable. And it is important for the state, in terms of developing their case against Mr. Williams, is to show exactly what Kente lived with and what exactly happened to him leading up to the days ultimately to where he died. This is very important evidence because it helps the jury understand what the specific intent was and sort of the nature of the magnitude of what this crime actually is.
Holding a young boy's head in the water for 30 to 45 seconds and burning his feet with hot water, awful. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. So you're listening to the defendant's audio interview with police where he's talking about how young Kente was having trouble in school. He had a really tough week. He was calling the principal and teacher derogatory terms. I think he hit a teacher a bunch of times. I'm here again with Gary Gerstenfield. I know we have to sign you off in a minute. So the idea that explaining why he needed to be disciplined, is that going into the defense's strategy later on when they take up their case about, hey, let's explain what happened to young Kente?
The defense has to try to show that the father was overwhelmed with a child with a lot of different challenges, a lot of issues. The child was acting out in school. And in other words, they're trying to present a case where you have a person who's just out of his element and his reacting in a way. Again, it's hard to understand watching this because, after all, we're dealing with a child who was drowned. But you're trying to show that this was a father who was simply out of control. He didn't know how to handle it. Of course, the jury's going to say, well, if you needed help, why didn't you ask for it?
And that's the point. And he adopted him. He made that choice. Unbelievable. Right. That's the critical point. Gary, thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to have you back on. And we will be back after this short break. Stay tuned.